Okay, thank you. Shortly after the Charlie Hebdo murders in Paris, Sebastian Coe advocated more public investment in sport as an activity through which to encourage positive values amongst alienated and disaffected young people. Sport was, he claimed, the deftest and the most effective of social workers. The use of sport for social purposes has a long history. As Neil Tranter has commented, even by 1914, it was no longer sufficient to play sport for its own sake. It was instead invested with an array of serious purposes and was seen as an essential force in the continuation of Anglo-Saxon civilization. How had this come about? From the 1880s... Oh dear.
Bottom arrow.
Thank you, yeah. From the 1880s onwards, the promotion of sport amongst young people, especially those living in inner urban areas, had become a key element of the work of organisations such as university and social settlements, lads and girls clubs and churches. Leisure and sport were harnessed to the social objectives of these organisations. The primary aim of the Salford Lads Club, for example, was to brighten young lives and make good citizens. Active leisure, in the form of sports and games, was a means to this end, developing the idea of membership of a group and responsibility towards it, and equipping members with the skills to participate in the democratic process. However, the outbreak of war in 1914 affected young people's participation in sport as volunteer club leaders and coaches entered military service and the school premises were used for the training of armed forces. Not only did this result in fewer opportunities for organised games, but young people themselves found their lives changed as they were recruited to the munitions industries to replace male employees who joined the armed forces. By July 1917, an estimated 600,000 young people, some as young as 14, had been recruited to the munitions factories. The social and physical well-being of young adults was no longer then limited to ethical or humane concerns, but to military success. They had in fact become crucial to the war effort. In the absence of male figures of authority at home and at work, because of joining the forces, juvenile delinquency, particularly amongst boys, increased. In Manchester and Salford, for example, there were in 1914 673 court cases of delinquency. By 1916, this had increased to 1,049. This sharp rise in juvenile delinquency raised government concerns about the physical and mental fitness and the morale of young munitions workers, and led to the formation in the Home Office of a Juvenile Organization Committee to increase the engagement of young people in what we might now call positive leisure activities by coordinating voluntary provision for sport and leisure opportunities amongst young adults. The committee was intended to support voluntary youth organisations to recruit more members and to address the difficulties caused by the war in the use of school premises as club rooms and play centres. It was, as a historian of the voluntary movement noted, the first tentative venture on the part of the state towards direct intervention in voluntary sport and leisure provision of young people. As such, it was historically significant as an important point in the incorporation of sport within social policy, a soft power through which to exercise social control. The main purpose of the Central Committee was to guide and support local juvenile organisations committees in the engagement of young people in leisure activities, sports and games. These local committees operated by establishing local partnerships of organisations concerned with sport and leisure provision. They were typically composed of representatives of the local education authority, voluntary bodies such as lads clubs, girls clubs, educational associations, church-based associations and university settlements through which sport and leisure activity could be coordinated for young people, a function perhaps not too dissimilar to today's sport and physical activity alliances. In 1918, government responsibility for the Juvenile Organisation Committees was transferred from the Home Office to the Board of Education. This was significant because the 19 Education Act empowered local education authorities to promote extracurricular, social and physical training. And I've just underlined the key points on this extract from the Act, particularly I think the emphasis on social and physical training, because clearly what's going on is meant to have social objectives as well as perhaps physical fitness objectives. At the close of the war, the objectives of juvenile organisation committees developed beyond a narrow focus on juvenile delinquency and began to take a wider concern for the welfare and social being of young people, and became a principal means through which voluntary social service organisations with a vested interest in leisure, such as the YMCA, YWCA, Scouts, Guides and Lads Clubs and Girl Brigades, could coordinate their provision locally, contact other organisations for the purposes of interclub competitions, and find access to facilities and playing fields. Jocks were most successful where there were successful active local councils of voluntary social service, and they were kind of put leisure within the remit of social service. And here's a comment from Clift at the National Conference of the National Council of Social Services in 1920, who was the organising secretary to the Board of Education, and it really could equally have been taken from the pre-war period. You know, it's again this concern about the leisure activities of young people, which aren't the right leisure activities and which have to be addressed. And again, this phrase, neglect of national civic duty, so it's sort of kind of linking leisure to these ulterior social objectives that it seemed to have. You know, it's almost a sort of an interwar reinvention of rational recreation, but this time under the aegis of social service. Juvenile organisation committees have not enjoyed much positive criticism. The fact that they were not compulsory and that they varied in the ways in which they worked led several interwar writers to minimise their impact. Neither is there a large body of literature on jocks. Central records are few, and it's likely that much more local archival research will be necessary to give a complete picture of their operations. Yet, records that do exist do not support the view that they were always ineffective or unimportant. On the contrary, it's possible to argue that they were in fact a significant step in the development of social policy on the leisure of young people. It was estimated that by 1920, approximately 140 local organisations have been established throughout England and Wales, and Madeline Roof, in a magisterial survey of girls' organisations in 1935, later reported that 61 of those were still in existence. While some juvenile organisation committees concentrated on the organisation of local sports leagues, others aimed to coordinate and foster a more all-round programme which included sport and other leisure activities amongst all the youth organisations of their district. Jocks supported sports clubs to maintain a service through providing grants for the equipment or the use of halls. The Bradford Jock was highly active in establishing a network of sport clubs and leaders, volunteers and welfare bodies such as churches and charities, and invested effort in establishing access to clubs and games facilities where none currently existed. So what juvenile organisations committees were doing was operating under the aegis of local education committees, because that's where the 1918 Education Act had placed them, and then the role of that committee was to try and establish a network of organisations within that district that had some connection to youth leisure, and to use that to sort of strengthen provision, develop competitions, and generally provide a more coordinated approach in the voluntary sector, because there's not much state provision at this time, to young people's leisure. This sort of connects into Catherine's paper, because I just want now to take a little step back to look at the impact of the expansion, the growth of industrial welfare on juvenile organisations committees. The early development and spread of jocks was boosted considerably by the expansion of industrial welfare at the end of the war, First World War, of course. Concerned about the social and physical well-being of young munitions workers, the government actively encouraged factory welfare as a means of supporting the needs of young people and ensuring their ability to continue supporting the war effort. In 1915, the Ministry of Munitions established a Healthy Munitions Workers' Committee to research and recommend on action to promote the personal health and physical efficiency of the worker, and advocated that the coordination of recreation and physical activity should become the responsibility of a factory welfare supervisor. So factory welfare supervisors were not only responsible for workplace safety, the role we normally associate them with, but particularly in terms of young people, the provision for recreation outside the factory after working hours. So local juvenile organisations committees were clearly useful to welfare supervisors in providing access to networks, contacts and facilities through which factory-based sports games could be played competitively against other clubs. And he did find a lot of the larger employers having representation on local juvenile organisation committees for that purpose. Not that they were particularly altruistically concerned about leisure for young people per se, but clearly there was a chance here to sort of control the leisure behaviour of their workers, keep them fit, keep them under control, keep them under surveillance, and keep them in the factory working hard. The volume of sporting and leisure activity enabled through jocks in the final years of the war was impressive, reflecting a large latent demand for sport and leisure amongst both male and female adolescents. The popularity of participatory sport in the early 20th century is, as Richard Holt has shown, statistically proven. Juvenile organisations committees give some insight as to how this was enabled. And we've got a few examples we can look at. So these are just some very brief insights to some of the things we're happening at a local level. So there's a fantastic amount of activity going on here that you know, we kind of know is happening out there, but we might not be quite sure how it's all being brought together. So in Birmingham, the Juvenile Organisation Committee dubbed itself as a civic recreation league that supported boys and girls clubs, recreation halls, playing fields, open air concerts, and then for girls, very traditional for the time, girls' activities. But interestingly, over there, then swimming, tennis and ladies' football. And there's quite a lot of ladies' football in this milieu. A lot of factory girl teams. I mean, Dick Kerr's team, ladies' team is the famous one. But there appear to have been an awful lot more of factory-based football teams for women. In Bristol, a huge scheme. The jock expanded to become something called the Bristol Recreation Council, which was not only for young people, but was meant to try and provide and coordinate leisure for all the industrial population of Bristol, to included juveniles and adults. So there's a massive amount of voluntary coordination of clubs, bowling greens, swimming pools, parks, tennis courts, you name it, to make sure that leisure provision facilities were available. West Ham, a football league, 2 divisions with 20 clubs, and 1,000 boys and men playing football in that job. Netball and sports for working girls too. So, you know, because girls are in the munitions industries, they're benefiting from quite a lot of this new interest in young people's leisure. Wigan, just down the road, 25 recreation grounds, 21 for football and 4 for girls hockey. Also arranging and organising competition in 3 divisions, 14 to 16, 16 to 19 and above. And those are just random examples of the sorts of activity I've been able to unearth to date. In policy terms, however, juvenile organisation committees were more than simply organising leisure activities. While their role in the control and discipline of young people might have initially been explained in terms of the war effort, they became, in the interwar years, the hub of a network of surveillance, as long-term unemployment became a norm. In 1933, a Board of Education model draft constitution for a local juvenile organisations committee recommended that they should include representatives of juvenile employment committees and the probation office, and work to ensure that young people, unemployed young people, attended approved courses on instruction. So juvenile employment committees were really set up on a local basis, like jocks, to try and get unemployed young people into work, but also to try and have some supervision of what they were doing in the spare time. And also to make sure that they attended juvenile instruction centres, because these were set up to sort of training facilities for young unemployed people to try and learn a new skill that might help them to find a job. So they're now part of Juvenile Organisation Committee provision, and clearly they've got they also don't have an altruistic interest in young people's leisure. In fact, in some cases, attendance at the Juvenile Instruction Centre was conditional and was a condition for admission to sports leagues under the social leisure activities. So in other words, whereas in the 19th century, sport and leisure had been a bait to get people into social provision, this time social provision was saying you can't have any sport and leisure unless you come and do the things that we want you to do. It was sort of a much harder lever. And in Bradford, home visits to parents of school leavers and unemployed young people were undertaken to encourage their children to join sports clubs and to attend evening classes. So that sort of charity organisation stuff, you know, it's using leisure as a gateway to home visits and you know, intrusively persuading parents to try and encourage their sons and daughters to attend the centres. So sport was in effect becoming a policy gateway to the private lives of ordinary citizens. So to move to some sort of conclusion, Juvenile Organisations Committees mark an important phase in the development of young people's everyday leisure and sport activity. In functional terms, they supported local sports clubs and voluntary bodies such as Lads and Girls Clubs, the YMCA and the YCA, and also factory-based sports clubs in the creation and provision of a wide range of leisure and sport opportunities that would have been much diminished had they not existed. You know, clearly the whole sport and leisure for young people doesn't depend on these juvenile organisations committees, but we can see that where they exist, it gives it a considerable boost. They also help to form state voluntary partnerships, through which sport and leisure opportunities could be made available to disadvantaged young people. Also helped to lay the foundations for the introduction of the youth service, local education authorities being authorised to establish these in 1939. However, to return to Sebastian Coe's remarks on sport as a social worker, jocks became an important element in the wider network of the surveillance and control of young people's leisure time, especially the unemployed, and the maintenance of social order and behaviour. Through sport and leisure, they brought young people into the view of local networks of youth organisations, linking voluntary sport and leisure organisations with public bodies such as local education departments, probation officers, juvenile employment committees, and the welfare departments of large employers. Sport became a policy tool, not something for its own sake, but an instrument of social policy around the behaviour of young people. Joseph Nye's concept of soft power, exercised not through coercion or criminalisation, but through policy and cultural practice, seems to hold some relevance to the theory and practice of juvenile organisations committees, whose workings demonstrate that, in interwar Britain, the political use of sport was evident at the furthest reaches of the everyday lives of young people in ordinary communities.
We're always worried about young people, aren't we?
Yeah.
Always dangerous place. Questions?